Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. You are most welcome here. So last week we created some tombstones for our haunted hide and seek game. And if you missed that video, I'll include a link up here and also down in the description. If you missed it, what we're doing is creating a graveyard that is Disney inspired. I didn't want it to appear that our characters had left us, though, so instead of epitaphs, the little sayings on the stones are about a game of hide and seek among the stones. So last week we created the tombs. This week we're going to create the characters. Let's go have some fun.
So for Stitch, I just wanted to have him peeking over the top of his tombstone. And if you watched the first video, you've already seen Stitch. And I do seem to have some missing footage of me drawing him out on cardboard and cutting him out and making sure that that was the size and shape that I wanted. So once I had that cardboard version of Stitch, I traced him out on some of the pink insulation foam. And this piece, it's another piece that this one I happen to have in my basement that is 1/2 inch. So that is less expensive than the thicker foam. So I just cut him out of the foam with a craft knife, and Stitch has those little pieces out of his ears, so I cut those out too. Now, for some reason, I decided that I wanted to try to make him a little bit three-dimensional, so you can see what I did and decide whether you think that's a good idea or not. Because of the sort of animation of Lilo and Stitch, I don't think it was really necessary to try to make him three-dimensional. But so what I did was I wanted the ears and the hair to be a little bit more in the background, and I wanted the nose to be in the foreground. So I cut one piece, which you can see is the shape of the entire head, and then I cut another piece, which is the head without the ears, to glue on top of that, and then I cut a third piece, which is the nose, to glue on top of that. I did give it a little bit of a neck because I just wasn't quite sure exactly how I was going to attach it to the tombstone yet, but in the end I end up cutting most of that off because I didn't use it. I used clear Gorilla Glue to glue Stitch together. With the clear Gorilla Glue, you spray it with water, you spray the surface with water so that it's just a damp, and then you apply the Gorilla Glue. And I used toothpicks to hold things in place, but I only left them in for about 1/2 an hour because I didn't want the toothpicks to get glued in. For Grogu, I wanted him to be peeking out on the left side of his tombstone, and I found a reference photo with him peeking around a corner. I did create an entire Grogu. I didn't create just a piece of him, just the part that would be showing, like I did with Stitch. That way I could adjust exactly how far I wanted him to be sticking out from behind the tombstone, and also he would look better from behind, although the way I'm positioning these in my yard, you won't see any of them from behind. They really aren't intended to be viewed that way. So I just sort of had the tombstone in place over the thinner foam and then sort of sketched a Grogu next to it. And then when I removed the tombstone, I finished and sketched the rest of the Grogu. And then, of course, I cut him out. Now with Boo, I thought I would have her to the right of her tombstone, and of course I thought it would be fun to have her in the little monster costume that Sully and Mike create for her. So what I thought was I would use this sort of flexible stuff, which I also found in my basement, but I think it is called Sil Seal, Flexible Polyethylene Foam Gasketing Strip, because I looked it up and that's what the website said. So I'm going to use that for her costume and her flipper, and I'm going to have her to the right of her tombstone with the flipper sort of touching the tombstone, and she'll be peeking around to the right. Now, I didn't cut out an entire Boo. I cut out most of Boo, but the right side of her. I thought this flexible stuff was perfect for the costume because I could cut it in strips and it would give a look just like the way her costume looks. It seems to be made out of strips. I think it was fabric from a chair that we saw in Sully and Mike's apartment. I used this same flexible material to make Grogu's little cloak. I made the cowl separately from the cloak. I brought Stitch outside to sculpt him. I'm using a sanding block and I'm also using a Dremel. I sand with the Dremel and I also do a little bit of carving with the Dremel like I did with the tombstones. I'm wearing a respirator and again, I'm outside where it is well ventilated. So I just tried to smooth out the transitions between the pieces that I had created and round off his nose. I would not actually recommend rounding off this piece, again, because of the way the animation is drawn, because later I'm going to outline him in black, just like in the animation style, and it's difficult to do that on rounded edges. So again, I'm really not sure that this sort of dimensionality was necessary or even a good idea. Now with his mouth, again, I tried to route that out with the Dremel with the cutting bit, and I wasn't able to use the guide because the mouth was so close to the nose, it would bump into it, so I couldn't do that. So I didn't do a great job routing out the mouth, and it really was completely unnecessary and would have been much easier to paint if I hadn't done that. So of course, if you're going to make this, do it your way. I think a single one-dimensional or, well, two-dimensional piece without any extra pieces on it would be perfectly fine, and then you just painted it would look just like Stitch, especially if you're a better painter than I am. Now, once everybody's all cleaned off, I gave them all what I was thinking of as a primer coat of white acrylic paint. And I did only do the primer coat on the front of the pieces, or the parts of the pieces that would be showing, so the fronts and the edges. I will paint the back. I'm going to paint the back in the same colors roughly that I paint the front, but again, the backs aren't really supposed to show, so I'm just going to give them a coat of a color paint so that they don't look weird. So that Grogu's head will be green, for example, and Stitch's head will be blue, but I don't think it's necessary for that to be a really good covering, so I didn't do the primer coat. And I will say this, I don't want you to make the same mistakes that I made when I created this. The regular foam paints up just fine, but the seal, that flexible foam, you paint it and at first it looks fine, and then when you move it, it starts to crack. So for Boo, her costume, the body part of her costume was fine because I wasn't moving that at all. But for her flipper and for Grogu's cowl, which I have to move around Grogu, I painted that separately from the other pieces. Those pieces cracked. The way to solve that is to mix the paint with some either white glue, but that will come out a little shiny, or some matte Mod Podge. I recommend matte Mod Podge. So mix in maybe 1 part Mod Podge to 2 parts paint, and paint with that mixture. It will dry, but it will stay more flexible, so I think you won't get cracking if you do that. What I ended up doing was painting over the parts that cracked with that mixture, and they didn't crack again. Now for colors. For Boo, I'm using Joanne Craft Essentials Purple as the very first coat for her costume, and I really was just using the paint that I had in the house. So I have a very old collection of paints that I've obtained over the years as I've done various craft projects. So I don't even know if this is sold anymore, this Joanne Craft Essentials, but I'm sure that you can find colors that are colors that match closely enough. I'm not saying this is an exact match for Boo's outfit, but it was a purple I had that I thought worked reasonably well. Now for her flippers and the teeth of the costume, they're pretty much white, so I just painted those with the acrylic white paint. For her skin, I have this old and unfortunately named Deco Art flesh tone, and it wasn't Boo's flesh tone, and it wasn't Lilo's flesh tone. I'm sure it's somebody's flesh tone. But if you have a flesh tone paint or a light peach paint, you can mix it with white or browns to get different flesh tones. So I think I had to mix this one with some white to match something closer to Boo's flesh tone. And I used the flesh tone unmixed to sort of line. Then I used some various peaches like Top Notch Peach and Folk Art Coral Reef for her cheeks and her lips, and I also mixed a little red into that for her lips. For her eyes and lining like her eyes, her eyelashes, and her hair, those are a combination of burnt umber, and then for the hair I dragged some black paint through that. For all of them, you can take your sort of base color paint and mix it with white to make highlights, and mix it with a darker color like a black or a brown, or just a darker version of whatever that color is to get lowlights. So I did try to do a little bit of shading by mixing those paints and putting them in appropriate places, like darker in the corner of the eyes, darker around the nose, that sort of thing. To finish off the purple part of Boo's costume, I just took a craft stick and a piece of foam and made something that was sort of a scale-shaped stamp by gluing the piece of foam to the craft stick. And then I used a pewter paint. I would think any sort of silvery paint would do, and I stamped that all over the costume. Now that doesn't really look like her costume. Her costume is really darker, the scales are darker, but I thought that it was close enough that it gave you the sort of the impression of scales on the costume. And then I washed over the entire thing once that had dried with a darkened version of the purple paint. So I just gave it sort of a light dark wash over it to, I don't know, deepen the color a little bit. Now for Grogu, he is granite gray and English ivy green mixed together. Those are both by Apple Barrel, so that's his skin. And his ears are one of the peach colors, probably mixed with a little bit of brown or white. I know I mixed it to make it darker for the inside of the ears. His eyes are black, but then I went in with a darker version of the green, so I mixed some dark gray into the English ivy green to put the colored part of the eye, the iris, and then I put even lighter colors in there to make his eyes look like human eyes. I don't really remember what Grogu's eyes look like up close, but to make them look a little bit more natural. For Grogu's robe and cowl, I painted them a color which is white with just a tiny bit of the burnt umber mixed in to get that very light tan. And then once that had dried, I brushed burnt umber over it. I also used the burnt umber to add some seams to the robe, like you would see in reference photos of Grogu. Now Stitch, for his ears I used the same purple that I used for Boo, the Joanne Craft Essentials, but that wasn't quite the right color, so I mixed some red into it. For his face, it's a color called Deco Art Americana True Blue that I mixed a little bit of white into, and then for around his eyes I mixed more white into that. For his nose and for the claws on his fingers, I mixed black into that, and his eyes are black. His teeth are a little bit off-white, and his tongue is sort of a corally red and with a darker red in his mouth. Now Boo's costume needs the eyeballs, and I just used these foam balls that I got at the Dollar Tree. They come in a package of 3. I think they're about a 2-inch diameter. I think a larger ball would have been better for the costume, but I didn't have larger balls. Now for the parts around the eyes are supposed to be lamps, and so for the parts around and for the part that attaches to her head, or the costume's head, I used the sill seal. So for the eyes, what I did was I cut a square of the sill seal and I glued the eye to the center of the square, and then I brought the square up around the eye all the way around. So they're going to be, you're going to pinch it on either side, so it'll be smooth all the way around, say the top and the bottom, and you'll have pinched it on the sides. And I used hot glue to glue it on. Now you have to be careful with hot glue with this stuff because it will melt. So maybe put the hot glue on, let it start to cool, and then squish this stuff into it. And then I just sort of tried to Christmas package the sides of it there to make it look not too conspicuous. So that, to me, was the easiest way to cover the eyes. And then for the eye stalks, I used some wire, and this is some pretty strong wire, so it stands up very easily, and I just glued pieces of the sill seal over that. When I painted the eyes, I just painted a black circle. I painted the sill seal gray because I did go back and watch the movie, and as far as I could tell, that part of the costume is gray. It isn't particularly shiny or anything. Now for Boo's hair, I think Mike and Sully use a mop, and so did I. So I got this mop from the Dollar Tree, and you can just pull the mop pieces out of the mop, those pieces of string. So I did just pull them out, cut them so that they looked basically like my reference photo, and just glued them to the top of her head. And there are a lot of layers. I don't show you all of that because it's just more of the same. I just kept cutting it and gluing it to the head until I thought it looked as close to the reference photo as possible. Now for Stitch's hand, I tried to make a more anatomically correct paw with wire and the sill seal, and it came out looking so terrible. I was so happy with this version, and it was so much easier. I just cut basically ovals out of the 1/2-inch foam, and then I cut triangles, and I just sort of shaped them so that they looked like claws. And even though there's no hand over the top of the tombstone, I really thought that this looked pretty good. At least if you had seen the bad one, I think you would agree that this looks great. So what I did was I painted the blue that is Stitch's base color for the knuckles, and then the claws are the color of the nose, so darkened version of that paint. Now Stitch I attached to his tombstone. And the advantage to not attaching things to the tombstones is they're easier to store, because you would be able to store them flat. But Stitch really needed to be attached. So I used a combination of toothpicks and hot glue. So basically just use the toothpicks to hold things in place and then glue them down. For Grogu and Boo, I thought it would be better to be able to stake them in the ground. It would give me more control over their placement. So I used the same method that I used for the tombstones. I just cut with my knife a little sort of slot, and I inserted these garden fabric stakes that you use to hold down landscaping fabric. I inserted those and hot glued them in. When I set these up, I just used a toothpick to hold Boo's flipper onto the tombstone. So I just stuck a toothpick through the flipper onto the tombstone after I'd already positioned the tombstone and Boo. So there's no glue there. When I take this down, I'll be able to take them down separately. Now, just because we have tombstones with epitaphs or, funny sayings, and plain tombstones or tombstones that just say haunted hide and seek, doesn't mean somebody can't hide behind those plainer tombstones. So I thought it would be fun to have just a little glimpse of a few other characters behind the tiny tombstones. So it had to be a small character, and I wanted to make it characters that maybe somebody would think of because they'd seen characters that they recognize. So if we see Stitch, then having a little glimpse of Lilo's Hawaiian dress, we should realize that's Lilo. So I wanted to have Lilo because she's a child, so she's pretty small, whereas if I wanted to do Sully, that wouldn't be realistic because he's huge. You can maybe do Mike, but I decided to do Lilo and BB-8, who is a very small little droid. And what I did was I just printed out pictures, or I found reference photos and made them as large as I could and printed out the pieces that I needed. So I printed out just half of Lilo, and I printed out all of BB-8, but I didn't intend to use all of that. And I glued them to some cardboard. I thought they would fit in better with the entire display if I painted over them. I think you could use them just as they are, but I thought if I paint over them, they'll look a little less perfect and a little bit more handmade, like my other characters. So I did just paint over them, and then I cut them out, and I don't think I show it here, but I glued some garden stakes to the bottom of them as well. And then I could just stake them behind the little tombstones so that you just get a little glimpse of BB-8 and Lilo. Now here's how it looks with our 3 main characters. Here's how it looks with the explanation tombstones, haunted, hide and seek, but without the extra characters. And here's how it looks with everybody.
So what did you think of our final version of the haunted hide and seek tombstones? I'll admit I was super intimidated by the idea of painting Grogu and Stitch and Boo, but I was pretty happy with the way they came out in the end. And if you're intimidated by that too, then you could always do what I did with Lilo and BB-8 and just print out pictures and Mod Podge them to the piece of foam or piece of cardboard and then paint over them, or not. Just leave them the way they are. You can also imply that the characters are there. You don't have to show the whole character. I think that that is actually a lot of fun. I think that a child or an adult might enjoy seeing just a little glimpse of one of their favorite characters. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. That lets me know that you enjoy this sort of content, and then I know that I should bring you more. And if you like this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.